So we buy land, machinery, and inputs in partnership with those farmers. We focus a lot on land improvement, so actually making the land more productive, and help farmers with the overall management, though we rely on the individual partner to manage largely their own operation with our support wherever we can be helpful. We have 25 partners across the country. We've raised $450 million and invested it in those farm partnerships. And our unique approach is really designed as an ESG approach, which is in addition to the farmer owning the part of the farm that they can afford to own, they earn extra income and appreciation as a result of the partnership. So they actually earn part of the income and part of the appreciation on the farm that we invest in. We are signatories of TCFD, which helps organizations disclose climate-associated risks. We are also signatories of PRI, so Principles of Responsible Investing, which focuses on disclosure right across ESG metrics. And we believe investing in a kind of ESG or impact appropriate way is an opportunity. That really we can build very sustainable and stable businesses in partnership with farm operators by capitalizing them right, and by aligning the interests of our investors and the partners, we can build partnerships that outlast kind of other options. So we think it's a much better model than, say, a landlord rental model. The sustainability does require a very clear focus on environmental, social, and governance. And while TCFD looks at environmental risks, we actually think that a lot of the management structures behind environmental risks can be actively managed through the social and governance approach. So let me start first with governance. Many think less about governance, especially as it relates to kind of single assets or operations. But what we see is that by partnering and leaving most of the decisions at the operational local level, so having a local actor, in our case our farm partner, make the decisions in their local context, we get much better outcomes. And that's not just outcomes from governance way, like it's not just that the process is better, but actually the environmental and social outcomes that we see are much stronger than if we had mandated or made head office policies. This can be seen throughout history in corporate-based towns. So if you look at Hershey and Ford, they ushered in a whole wave of kind of social advances, largely because the owners of those businesses actually lived locally. And we see it also on the environmental side. So people are really careful to make sure that land is treated well when it is treated well environmentally when they're living locally. Communities are really good at regulating themselves. As I like to say, if our farmer treats land badly, their kid gets beat up at school, which isn't an advocate for bullying, but does kind of give you some sense that community actors and leaving more decisions locally actually makes a huge difference on how you have to think about the environmental risks, because there is so much social pressure to make sure that the decisions are made well. We see the same thing from a social standpoint. So by having local decisions made, we have higher wages. By our specific approach, where we partner with the farmer and they earn part of the appreciation, we see that we're able to keep wealth locally. And by sharing the appreciation locally, the communities keep more of the money, and that results in kind of lower headline risk. And also, I think, a bit more of an understanding of what might be an appropriate kind of bargain between capital and community. In an environmental context, we see the same kind of things. So environmentally, if we get governance right and we get the social aspect right, we have a much shorter list of of environmental risks to both disclose and actively manage, which means in lots of cases, so in our case, when we look at farms on land improvement, for example, so what part of the land can we make higher productive versus what part of the land should be maintained in a unproductive or less productive state because it has some other natural benefit. If we leave those decisions to the local actors, we see them knowledge of the history that can bring us kind of reduce our own risk. So the areas that we designate as wetlands or areas that we keep for natural grazing because they're home to migratory birds or things like that are actually really well defined, and we're able to have our partners work with the local agencies to make sure that they agree with the decisions. Coming to TCFD as kind of how we think about our own climate-related disclosure and what it's meant for us to go through that process is, like anything else, a process forces a bit of thinking that might not otherwise be there. In our case, that thinking has been about climate in a long-term way. So our operations are what's called dry land row crop operations, meaning all of the water that is used on the crop is just rainwater. So we don't irrigate. Given that, rain makes a massive difference to our year-to-year productivity and, as a result, our profitability, as does other natural weather events. Flooding has an impact, freezing has an impact, high summer temperatures have an impact. And so through the disclosure and understanding where our risks are, we have started looking at not necessarily ways to manage those risks, as a number of them are not super manageable, but at least to be more resilient in the face of them. So thinking about regenerative agriculture and how we can implement that in the context of a changing climate and what that might mean for us, and then translating kind of that resiliency to the farmers in terms of dollars. And also climate models and whether we can use those to be predictive of areas that we should farm in versus areas we might not want to buy in. So to actually set our overall asset allocation strategy. I think that strategic thinking has been probably more important for us in terms of building confidence around our own investment process right now than it has been for investors. I think for investors, it's at least in our case, it's kind of a hurdle, like a bar that you have to meet just to be considered investable. But taking the process really seriously and understanding what those risks are and how we can best manage them in our specific case can build a lot of value for our strategy. Luckily, because of how we started, that idea of having the farmer in charge of many of the decisions and how they might help us approach thinking about these risks was already ingrained. But for anybody who's at a different point or has a different starting place, I think it probably is worth really starting locally to source ideas for both the risks that you're going to face and potentially how to manage those. Because, as I said, what we see is that local thinking is probably more productive than head office thinking once you've made an asset allocation decision. I really appreciate being here and having this time with you, and would be happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Mary Draves, Chief Sustainability Officer and Vice President of EH&S at Dow. One of the challenges for corporations today is how to manage evolving sustainability risks and integrate them into your strategy and business planning. Today I'll talk about Dow's systematic approach and how it has helped us identify opportunities to build value and resilience over the long term. As a leading material science company, Dow uses focused innovation and its material science expertise to achieve profitable growth and create sustainable solutions. In fact, sustainability is central to our company's purpose, to deliver a sustainable future for the world through our material science expertise and in collaboration with our partners. As a company that makes the materials that go into so many products that touch our lives, we play an essential role in addressing critical challenges around sustainability. Our businesses deliver a broad range of science-based solutions for customers in high-growth market segments, including packaging, infrastructure, mobility, and consumer applications. And with our global reach, operating 104 manufacturing sites in 31 countries, our innovations help people everywhere. Setting sustainability targets is not new to Dow. This year, our company is 125 years old. Since our founding, we have had a tradition of saving energy, reducing waste, and focusing on safe and efficient operations. And chemistry and innovation will be key to delivering a low-carbon future for society. Dow products enable a lower CO2 footprint than alternatives, 3 to 4 times in some cases, through lighter and more fuel-efficient cars, more energy-efficient buildings, food that stays safe and fresher longer. All critical for a world set to add 2 billion people by 2050. We're now on our third set of 10-year sustainability goals, which we call our 2025 goals, which emphasize collaboration and blueprint thinking. During the past 15 years, our company has also reduced our overall carbon emissions by 15%, while also growing our business. Yet we're committed to doing more. By 2030, we're targeting a reduction in annual carbon emissions by another 15%. By 2050, we plan to achieve zero carbon emissions. Across the company, we're taking action to reduce our carbon footprint and advance a circular economy while helping meet steadily rising demand for safe and sustainably produced materials for our customers and society. Sustainability is a major factor in our long-term planning. First and foremost, it's a key driver for our growth and value. It's also certainly an element of our risk management. Our future success depends on how successful we are in creating value for the environment, society, and the economy with our products, processes, and technologies. Today, I'll talk about the actions and activities we're taking to address sustainability risks and increase transparency. First, how we identify sustainability trends at an early stage to better understand and respond to risks. Then, how sustainability is part of our governance, compensation systems, and business models, ensuring accountability at every level in our company. And how we're using our systematic approach to not only minimize risks along the value chain, but to identify new business and growth opportunities. We use several tools to identify and prioritize risks and opportunities, including a sustainability materiality assessment, a stakeholder engagement process, and our enterprise risk management process. These are comprehensive, cross-functional processes used to develop corporate strategy across all our business units. Let's start with our materiality assessment. Engaging a wide number of stakeholders, both externally and internally, has helped us identify the issues that are most important to our businesses and where we can make the most impact. This process helped us define our 3 strategic sustainability pillars: circular economy, climate protection, and safer materials. We also established an independent Sustainability External Advisory Council in 1992. Here, international experts from academia and society contribute their perspectives, helping us expand our strengths and address the potential for improvement. Risk management also is a strategic activity within Dow, and our ability to manage risks creates opportunity as well. On an annual basis, Dow leadership reviews the risks to the enterprise. This process involves the highest level of our company, including our board of directors. The board is responsible for overseeing the overall risk management process. This includes review and approval of the enterprise risk management model and the process implemented by management to identify, assess, manage, and mitigate risk. The process is comprehensive and includes several areas of focus critical for our short and long-term success, including material substitution and sustainability trends, regulatory trends, competitive feedstocks and energy, customer experience and retention, pandemic events, cyber threats, operational events, regional political events, and many, many more. The approach is about quantifying environmental and economic impact and we update or develop mitigation plans by businesses for the enterprise. Understanding risks helps us embrace complexity and accelerate performance. By viewing risk more broadly than just compliance, we anticipate challenges, seize opportunities faster, and emerge from setbacks sooner. Let's take climate change as an example. It takes energy and heat to create many of these beneficial to society chemistries, and so transitional risks, such as regulatory changes focused on energy and emissions, are very important to us. One action we're taking to decrease the potential impact of energy and emissions-focused regulation is to reduce our footprint. We're reducing our overall energy usage and greenhouse gas emissions by optimizing our facilities and implementing new technologies. We also are collaborating with industry associations to support regulatory measures to address climate change. For example, we support carbon emissions pricing and advocate for a realistic approach to allowance allocation, carbon leakage, technological limits, and cross-industry projects. In addition, Dow is one of the pioneering companies to incorporate a carbon price into its business planning and risk management strategies. The price of carbon is included in internal planning for all capital projects, including jurisdictions without existing carbon emission pricing legislation. Climate change may also result in physical risks, such as more frequent incidents of severe weather or long-term changes in precipitation patterns. It's important to engineer our facilities to better withstand severe weather and address water availability, especially at our water-stressed sites, for continued safe operation of our facilities. So, we continue to study the long-term implications of changing climate parameters on water availability, plant siting issues, and impacts and opportunities for products. So that's the risk side. And just as important, we also see our opportunity for industry to generate the solutions needed to transition to a low-carbon economy. The increasing demand for low-carbon and circular products creates a compelling business opportunity for Dow, one we are capitalizing on as we advance our strategy to decarbonize our footprint, grow our earnings, and further enhance value for our stakeholders. Our products often reduce greenhouse gas emissions more than the carbon footprint used to manufacture them, and we continue to align investments in our R&D portfolio with a low-carbon future. These lower carbon innovations help our customers reduce their emissions and meet their sustainability goals. Across our market verticals, sustainability is a key driver of growth. We see our total addressable market expanding from $650 billion to more than $800 billion by helping solve sustainability challenges such as waste reduction, improved energy efficiency, and safer, higher performing, and more circular consumer products. These lower carbon innovations also help our customers reduce their emissions and meet their sustainability goals. We also see continued opportunities to improve the carbon footprint of our operations. How? By sourcing cost-competitive renewable power, improving raw material efficiency, and implementing low-carbon technologies. Recognizing this opportunity, we laid out a pathway during our Investor Day in October to decarbonize our asset footprint and grow earnings. We're taking a phased site-by-site approach to replace end-of-life assets with carbon emissions technologies that lower emissions while expanding capacity, starting with our investment at our site in Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta. At Fort Saskatchewan, we announced plans to build the world's first net-zero carbon emissions ethylene and derivatives cracker complex, while more than tripling the ethylene and downstream derivative capacity at the site. These investments will enable Dow to capture increasing demand for low-carbon products at differentiated prices and support our customers' efforts to reduce their carbon emissions. They are also a critical part of our plan to reduce emissions by a total of 30% by 2030 versus our 2005 baseline and achieving zero carbon emissions by 2050. As our actions demonstrate, sustainability is moving from an actively largely led by corporate social responsibility to an area closely integrated with overall corporate strategy and business activities. As such, investors, governments, and businesses are looking for a framework to improve public disclosure of climate-related financial information and help companies better structure their internal approach to assessing climate risks and opportunities. Consistent and harmonized climate disclosure standards reduce resources and unlock growth. Reliable and comparable climate-related disclosures are critical for better pricing of climate-related risks, more effective risk management and market discipline, and effective allocation of capital toward financing green and transition activities. Dow has been an early proponent of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. Dow is a member of TCFD and has employed considerable efforts towards principle-based disclosures aligned with the recommendations of the TCFD. We believe that TCFD, if adhered to by a wide range of companies, would improve consistency, comparability, and transparency of climate-related disclosures and provide more decision-useful information for investors and other stakeholders. The TCFD recommendations provide a good baseline disclosure framework for risk assessment, capital allocation, and strategic planning. We see this as complementary to the Global Reporting Initiative, which addresses sustainability concerns for a broad range of stakeholders. Dow has been a sustainable reporting leader in our industry, and we're committed to continuous improvement of ESG reporting and disclosures, and we're implementing TCFD disclosure recommendations this year. Dow's commitment to ESG is closely aligned with our ambition to be the most innovative, customer-centric, inclusive, and sustainable material science company in the world. Sustainability is more than an important ambition for Dow. It is key to how we apply science to drive growth, improve our operations, and help solve some of the world's most complex challenges. We have set forth an accelerated roadmap for our sustainability agenda, a roadmap focused on the critical sustainability needs of our industry and where we can make the most significant difference. We also support ESG accountability across the company by adding ESG metrics to our executive compensation and employee performance award programs. Turning our attention to the economic, environmental, and social impacts of our actions helps us frame our decisions based on these long-term factors, creating a more profitable and resilient enterprise and a more sustainable future for all.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jill Blickstein, and I'm the Managing Director for ESG at American Airlines. I'm delighted to be here with you today as we discuss these important issues. I'm going to start just with a quick overview of our climate change strategy, and then turn to how we think about assessing the risks and opportunities from climate change and how we have used TCFD at American Airlines as a tool in doing that. For our industry, as you know, addressing climate change has become an imperative both for our company and for all of our stakeholders, including our customers, our investors, and our employees. So if we can bring up the first chart, I'm going to talk about our goals for a second. We have a long-term goal to reach net zero by 2050. And we have committed to set a science-based target for the intermediate term, which for us, we are defining as 2035. If you've seen an airline wedge chart, this should look fairly familiar. The top line is our business as usual emissions, and certainly we hope to be growing as we emerge from COVID. The green wedges we've separated this into green and blue. And so the green is what is under our direct control. And so that very thin green wedge you see at the top, that's what we can do in our day-to-day operations to reduce emissions and fuel use. Reducing fuel is one of our largest expenses, jet fuel is. So the idea that, we just as a matter of corporate culture, right, we work very hard to reduce emissions on a day-to-day basis. But given that we rely so heavily on jet fuel, there's a limit to how much we can really eke out of the operational improvements. The larger green wedge comes from fleet renewal. So American Airlines has embarked on the biggest fleet renewal project in the history of commercial aviation. Over the last 7 years or so, we've invested more than $24 billion in more than 600 new aircraft. And here I'm talking about the Airbus 321, the Boeing, the MAX, and the Dreamliner. These are the most fuel efficient aircraft in their class. And we now have the youngest mainline fleet of any U.S. network airline. And that we're continuing to take into the fleet new aircraft, and that will continue to deliver to us emissions reductions over time. The blue wedges, though, are the things where we have to, they're outside of our direct control, and we have to work with partners in the industry and in government to help achieve these big emissions reductions that can come from what's in the blue. The first one is the dark blue, is the next generation of aircraft. And there we're talking about the next generation, so the generation after the MAX and the Dreamliner and the Neo, and then as well as alternate modes of propulsion. So I know you've been hearing about the idea of hydrogen propulsion and electric. Hydrogen, there's lots of promise there to retrofit, for example. We'll probably start on the smaller end. So the idea of retrofitting smaller regional jets with hydrogen fuel cells, there's a lot of interesting work going on there. And we're working closely with our OEMs and aircraft and engine partners on those new technologies. The light blue wedge is air traffic control reform. And you may know the aviation industry has been working very closely with the FAA and governments around the world for years to try to bring into the system more advanced technologies that will allow us to both fly more efficiently and, importantly, also to maneuver on the ground more efficiently. So instead of sitting in a taxi line, sitting in a taxi line before the runway with all the engines firing, right, waiting to take off, there are lots of new interesting pilots going on to figure out how maybe we could stay at the gate, engines off, and then maybe get to the island. That's just like one example of what ATC could do to us. And then the big blue wedge there is sustainable aviation fuel. And this is very exciting. This is a drop-in fuel that can be made from renewable sources like waste oils and fats, cover crops, ethanol, potentially one day municipal solid waste, and potentially one day pulling carbon out of the air and using it to make jet fuel. It has the same emissions as jet fuel when it's used on a flight, but since it's made from renewable sources, it has dramatically lower emissions. So, for example, the SAF, the sustainable aviation fuel that's made today, can reduce emissions by as much as 75% compared to petroleum-based jet fuel. And so there's a lot of promise in SAF. And then the last bit, the little gray wedge, is the idea of purchasing carbon offsets. We do most aviation plans looking out to net zero. It does look like it will take technology longer than 2050 to really develop to reduce in sector all of our emissions. So we expect to be purchasing carbon offsets, which we would do anyway because we expect to have a compliance obligation under CORSIA, which is the UN's global regulatory system to offset the emissions from international aviation. And we support that. And we're looking forward to the day when we will be back to 2019 levels and growing. And we will be buying, you can either buy SAF or buy offsets to meet CORSIA obligations. And we're taking action today on all of these fronts, including, I just want to mention, we're purchasing sustainable aviation fuel today. We're taking delivery of it into San Francisco, and that is fuel made from waste oils and fats. We've also made a $100 million investment in Breakthrough Energy Catalyst. And the idea of Catalyst is that Catalyst is one of the entities under the Breakthrough Energy umbrella. And the idea there is how to scale the technologies that American will need to really reduce our emissions, of which SAF is a key component. But I'm here today, so now I'm going to switch. I'd like to talk about how we think about climate risks and opportunities, right? We've heard from investors, major investors, all kinds of investors, not just the ones who care mostly about climate change, but from a broad range of investors, that they want to see a step change in climate risk management and disclosure. And so that is why in 2020, we started to use the TCFD framework to assess and disclose our climate risks and opportunities. We'd actually been doing corporate responsibility reporting for about a decade, including we had been disclosing our emissions, and we had been having our emissions numbers audited by a third-party firm. But in 2020, we decided to shift fully over to what is really an ESG report, by relying more on TCFD and the SASB vertical for aviation, really to meet investor expectations. But I don't in any way want to give the idea that, the impression that our approach to TCFD is done and dusted. I would really call this a journey, and I'll come back to that idea in a minute. So we started by making two key decisions. The first was we chose to engage an expert consultant. Because we wanted to start with a firm foundation on this, and frankly, because the way TCFD is structured and the way it uses climate scenarios in particular, I think can be a little intimidating and a little challenging for a firm that is not, particularly when you're doing this, I think, at the beginning. Our second choice was to start with a qualitative analysis, which was really important. It was probably more important than we understood at the time, but I think it was really a good way to introduce senior leaders across the firm into what the TCFD analysis requires, make everybody comfortable with that, and then embark on the quantitative piece, which we're doing today. This audience probably knows that TCFD has 4 primary components, right? Governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. And today I'm going to talk mostly about the strategy piece, because we've been covering off governance, risk management, and metrics in our annual reporting as a matter of course, but the strategy piece of TCFD requires a differently structured approach than we've been using. If you've attempted a TCFD, certainly on the transition side, right, it asks you to look at your risks and opportunities in terms of policy, technology, market, and reputation. So it's a very structured way to do it, which frankly made it easier. And while it was difficult at the time, so we were doing this in the middle of 2020, right, as our industry was facing immense challenges from COVID, it did, at the same time, we were able to have a set of very interesting conversations within American. You know, we were able to talk with senior leaders in finance and sales and network and operations about how the business will need to adapt as the economy transitions to net zeros in those categories. So, for example, how will policymakers respond over the medium and long term, particularly with regard to aviation? And we're already seeing the impacts of that in Fit for 55 in the EU, in the discussion about a SAF tax credit in the United States. So there's many different tools available to policymakers, and each set of tools will affect American differently. So it was a great conversation to talk through what those impacts would be. Another example is how will our customers think about technological alternatives to air travel? So, for example, having virtual meetings. We're seeing the impact of that today. Obviously, that will change over time. Our customers have lots of alternatives, but we can see in the return to business travel that they value that business travel. Another example is we're trying to buy SAF, and we have a net zero strategy that, as you can see, largely relies on SAF. But the SAF market today is so small that I can barely call it nascent, right? It's tiny, and it needs to grow exponentially to meet aviation's need for lower emissions, and we don't have decades to wait for it to grow. We really need to be acting today to help grow that market for SAF. And so the fact that TCFD is structured in these categories allowed us to have these conversations with senior leaders and get their viewpoint. And I will say that when I went through the TCFD analysis with smart people across finance and other parts of the company, they were raising to me new risks that we hadn't even thought about. So it was really a way to engage people in thinking about the long term and what climate will mean for the company. And you can bring up my second chart now. I just want to talk for a minute about the physical side of the risk. And this is just a piece of this is in our 2020 ESG report, by the way, and I had to truncate it so it would fit on the slide. So we looked at more sites than this. But we took a close look at our major hubs and our maintenance bases, and we looked at how they would fare under the different warming scenarios. You know, we obviously, as an airline, we get plenty of practice in managing weather every day, unfortunately, and we get practice in managing extreme weather as well. But the TCFD exercise is looking at the long-term changes in weather and how it might impact American. So for example, while airports on the coast may be impacted by flooding, it's also true that we have airports in our network that we call them hot and high. So when you have that combination of altitude and extreme heat, right, those conditions impact how much weight you can carry, and that impacts how much cargo and how many passengers you can carry. And so certain locations that are hot and high, climate affects those, it's not a matter of just of buying more air conditioning, for example. It actually does affect, aircraft performance. And so those are things we have to build, and that's when the TCFD analysis of what's happening with the climate scenarios in certain locations kind of meets what's actually happening with the operation of an airline in particular. And then, of course, on the other hand, our most valuable physical assets are our aircraft, and they are mobile. So, it's possible to think over time that as, for example, as coastal airports perhaps are underwater, we may have to think about changes to network. But what TCFD did was a very, very valuable way, really, in engaging senior leaders to think about not just the transition risk, but also about the physical shape of the network and the impact of climate change on our airports. And then it leads to really interesting conversations with our airports as well about what is their resiliency, which I think probably is the kind of underlying intent of that. Obviously, there's lots of uncertainty. The qualitative piece first, and we introduced all of these concepts to our senior leaders. I think that now doing the quantitative is going to seem like very much like a logical first step. And really, regardless of what we choose to disclose in terms of those numbers in our report, I think that having that conversation about how we think about the financial impacts is going to be a really good conversation that will evolve over time. And that's why I call this a journey. We were, I think, off to a strong start. I'm looking forward to this next set. And I think this is something that will build and have more and more value over time. And so I'm glad that we started on it. It has been a pleasure to join you. Thank you very much for the time today.
Hello, and welcome to this Economist event, Analysing Climate Change Transition Risk. My name's Guy Scriven. I'm the climate risk correspondent at The Economist, and I'm delighted to be moderating proceedings today. So the idea of this panel is to discuss the big transition risks facing businesses. So that's everything from kind of changing regulation to shifting consumer preferences and new technologies. And in particular, we're interested in kind of how firms can measure these risks and mitigate against them. So here to dig into this topic with me, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists. We have Lisa McDonald, the Chief Risk Officer at ATB Financial, Kathleen McLaughlin, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Walmart, and Michelle Dunstan, the Chief Responsibility Officer at AllianceBernstein. Kathleen, I was going to kick off by talking to you and asking you about how Walmart, the transition risks that Walmart faces. It's a hugely kind of familiar brand and operation to everyone, and it's kind of an enormous business, and you know, essentially kind of very important to a lot of people's everyday lives. So how are you thinking about transition risks, and what are the big ones that Walmart faces?
Well, thanks, Guy. It's great to be here. And I just put that in context by, providing a bit of information about our plans around getting to zero emissions by 2040 in our own operations. And then we have a science-based target for Scope 3 as well. So we've made commitments to decarbonize our business. So for us, when we consider transition risk, it's more a question of how that will affect our approach to hitting those targets rather than might it change what we do around emissions reduction. In the first place, we've already made that commitment. Excuse me. So for us, there are multiple risks that affect the ability for us to meet those zero emissions targets in a timely way. So I'll just share a few. First of all, some regulatory and technology risks as it pertains to energy choices we might make to power our buildings as well as our transportation fleet. And so that's everything from changes to subsidies and incentives around demand side energy management, renewable energy generation. That's a big issue for us in many of the jurisdictions where we operate. Changes to carbon pricing regimes. We are advocating for a price on carbon. We think that's necessary. So in the meantime, we don't really have a settled carbon pricing landscape. We're excited about Article 6. Maybe we can get into that a bit in terms of what that can enable. But that's a significant issue for us. Changes to energy and water standards as they would affect our building management. On the transportation side, a whole host of questions and uncertainties around standards for fleet efficiency for medium and heavy duty trucks, the incentives that might come into play to facilitate a transformation around zero emission vehicles and the infrastructure required to support them. So will we see a regime, for example, that is technology neutral and allows innovation and experimentation? Or do we have a risk of certain approaches getting favored over others, which could lead to stranded assets or inhibit innovation and so on? And then, of course, on the customer side, a number of questions around policies that might incentivize different choices of different categories. So more energy efficient products, It can even pertain to things like food and, favoring meat alternatives that might be lower emitting alternatives for the customer. So there's a whole host of sort of regulatory and technology and policy in general uncertainties around those aspects. And then finally, I would even say some surprising ones. So for a business like ours, a lot of emissions lie in supply chains. So even considering what may happen in the agricultural sector, for example, to accelerate regenerative agricultural practices and so on that will help us even tackle emissions far upstream in food production.
That's really interesting. So thank you for that. And I was gonna bring in Lisa now. So ATB's financial is obviously kind of a very different type of business. So I mean, how do you think about kind of transition risk? Just how does it affect your kind of lending and investment decisions as a financial firm?
Thanks, Guy. First, I'll start off by saying that the views that I'm going to offer today are my own and not those of my firm. But I'll jump in with sharing that there's, similar to Kathleen's comments, there are a number of different ways that financial services organizations are looking at transition risk. And for ATB, that perspective really starts with understanding what's happening with our clients. And so we are a financial services provider in the province of Alberta, Canada. And Alberta is, the Alberta economy is driven by a number of very dynamic economic sectors, including, of course, oil and gas, and also agriculture. And so we have a very unique opportunity to understand how our clients are responding and modeling transition risk. So as we look down into our client network, we see a number of different industries, similar to some of our panelists today, and obviously to everyone else who's attending this conference. So all firms are really looking at transition risk through a number of different lenses. Many are looking at it through the lens of looking at climate risk through the lens of ESG, because that's where investors and capital providers are expressing a lot of interest these days. There's a lot of regulatory change and policy intervention that Kathleen has mentioned, and also changing client demands. So, we have quite a diverse set of clients, and we are connecting with them to understand how they are identifying and assessing risk, both at an industry level and at a firm level. The really fun part is in understanding how our clients are mitigating that risk, and looking at lots of different degrees of innovation and changes to their operations. So we are seeing an acceleration of collaboration across industries now, where firms are looking at pooling funds, pooling expertise to innovate and find bigger solutions at an industry level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's fascinating, Lisa. Can you give me a specific example? Could you?
Sure.
Maybe you can't get into client specifics, but can you tell me a bit more about the kind of innovation side of that?
Yeah, I'll give you one, and that's with carbon capture, utilization, and storage mechanisms in the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of work in that space to look at different types of innovation for how carbon can be captured through the oil and gas production cycle, stored for future purposes, shipped for consideration and use in other products and services. So there's a lot of work happening in carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Alberta. It's pretty exciting for many different industries, actually, but primarily for oil and gas. Lots of work as well in agriculture around bringing great new technologies into the ag sector. Ag tech is an emerging industry that Kathleen referenced a little bit. There's a lot more sophistication moving into agricultural production, and there's lots across all of our industries. We are observing firms look at more efficient business models, more energy efficient, water efficient, waste management efficient practices. So We wear two hats as a financial organization. We're looking at all of this wonderful activity happen in our client base. And then we're also impacted directly as well as a player in the financial services sector. We're looking at changes in, the competitive landscape, how other banks' risk appetite is changing, and how the industry perspective is evolving on lending to high emitting sectors, in favor of supporting a strong energy transition, but also, to do that responsibly. And we are watching for, changes in regulations in the financial sector space. Federal and provincial regulators are looking at the resiliency of the financial system and whether or not banks are adequately capitalized to withstand uncertainty as we move through this transition. So there are quite a few paths in which financial services firms are impacted as well.
That's really interesting. So, Michelle, to bring you in, I wanted to ask you about. So both Kathleen and Lisa mentioned kind of various types of different transition risks. I wanted to ask you about how you kind of can measure and analyze these kind of risks. I mean, the risk that, suddenly a kind of handful of countries impose some type of carbon pricing, obviously you can measure that if you know which countries they are and what price they'll put on carbon, but something like that presumably is actually quite hard to capture. So how do you go about measuring these kind of risks?
Thanks, Guy. Delighted to be here. And that's a really good question. And it is one that is actually increasingly important to our business today. So we're an asset manager. We invest in about, our assets under management are about $800 billion globally. So we are investing in issuers, stocks, bonds, other instruments. And we view this as something we need to do to be a good asset manager. We often get questions from our clients, asset owners who are just getting up to speed on climate change that don't truly understand the impact that climate change is having, not 5, 10, or 50 years in the future, but today. So this is a financially material issue for us right now. It's impacting cash flows, it's impacting valuation multiples, and it's impacting cost of capital. We can reduce risk and improve financial returns by integrating climate change into our financial analysis. So, take an example, a manufacturing company that has factories that have carbon. Is carbon being taxed in the jurisdictions in which it operates today? If it is, you should be measuring that, including it in your cash flows. If it's not, what is the likelihood that it's going to become taxed at some point in the future? You can take a weighted average probability and include that in your financial analysis. If there's going to be cash out the door over the next few years, you'd want to understand that. What if there isn't going to be a carbon tax, but regulations are going to change, that this factory is going to have to install scrubbers? Again, that's going to be a CapEx hit, but as an asset manager, you'd want to understand. And then if you actually go further down the chain, some of those less tangible things. What about technology change? Has a competitor developed a new lower carbon alternative? Is your investment going to lose market share? Or is it going to have to spend money to actually develop that same product also? Or what about employees? They are increasingly making value-based decisions on where they want to work. We've seen some companies, take the oil and gas sector in particular, have tumbled down the ranks of where new university graduates want to work. What does that say about your company's capacity for technological innovation or keeping costs low if you are getting bottom of the barrel engineering talent? These are all real risks that are materializing right now, and one that we need to actually think about training and digging in on and educating all our investors on how to do.
And Michelle, just to follow up on that, I mean, so you listed a whole load of interesting and kind of, quite different types of risk there. Are you able to give me a sense of what you think is the most kind of material? I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
It's a really good question. And the fact is that it's going to vary. What physical and transition risks impact a particular company is really unique to the products and services that it produces, the industry and sector that it's in, the location that it's in, the regulatory environment that it's in, and how it has positioned itself in the market, what it's selling. So what we actually need to do is educate people. So like at AB, we're a deep fundamental research house with 300 professionals around the world that analyze these instruments. Most of them have been here for over a decade. We didn't hire them because they understand climate change, but because they're good financial analysts or portfolio managers. So we've had to take that deep expertise in fundamental research and point it at climate change. And you really need to equip people to deal with this very complex and very multi-layered issue. And we've done that actually by partnering with the climate school at Columbia University here in New York. And we're the founding member of their corporate affiliates program. Our first step was actually education. So we co-developed a climate change curriculum that included the basic science, public policy, legal, regulatory frameworks, climate change solutions, that how to translate that into financial analysis. We trained all our investors, over 300 of them. We actually offered to our clients last year, and over 1,000 of the world's largest asset owners enrolled. And we're now pivoting to research with Columbia. We have 5 different work streams with them. So we have to ensure that our analysts have the data and the tool sets and the support that's necessary. So this training gives them that basic one. How to identify, like you said, which issues are material, because it is a very diverse array of issues. We have ongoing training and education programs, and then there's a tiered system of support. The investors can handle a lot on their own with the tool sets that we have that provide them with a array of third-party and proprietary data and alternative data sets. If they can't do that, we have climate change experts at AB that can help them out. And if they can't get the answer through that, we then take our issues to Columbia and actually have interactions with the scientists. And I know you asked specific questions, but really you've heard from both Kathleen and Lisa, the issues that they're facing are very diverse. Everything from regenerative agriculture to carbon emissions to chlorofluorogases. It's a whole array of different things. And it's really difficult to say this is the one most important issue, which is why you need a lot of education, tool sets, data, and support to enable any organization to actually tackle this.
Sure, that makes complete sense. Thank you, Kathleen. I wanted to ask you about a kind of area that Michelle just brought up, which is data. So, so I started doing this job maybe 2-3 years ago, and at that point, a lot of the conversation was about data. There are huge gaps in the data. We don't really know who's emitting what. We don't really know where the kind of risks are. So I wondered whether you could give me a quick kind of two minute kind of run through of where we are with data and how much progress you think has been made in the past few years in kind of improving the state of data around climate transition risks. And Michelle and Lisa, if you guys want to jump in on this one, because I know everyone's very interested in this topic, do put your hand up and I can come to you too.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Well, you can tell by the comments we've made so far that we're talking about transformation of very complex dynamic systems. It's the entire economy that we're talking about transitioning over time. Perhaps unprecedented in human history to have the entire planet engaged together in transitioning the entire economy toward a goal of net zero. And so how do you model that? How do you model the risks associated with that? So what we found is there are some decisions and scenarios that we can create to inform those decisions where there's pretty decent data. And then there are others where who knows, and the best you can do is bound the problem. So I'll give you a couple examples. When it comes to actually understanding the physical risks, we have some decent scenarios from science to work with, right? So there's RP 8.5 when we use that. Hopefully worst case scenario around what could happen with the climate. And we were able to get a decent amount of insight into the impact of physical risks of climate on very concrete aspects of our business. So buildings, supply chain, surety of supply, transportation, future, and so on. When it comes to transition risk, every single thing we've talked about really depends on the actions of multiple people over time. And that's very difficult to model. So what we've done, for example, if you take energy, we can bound the problem and say, well, we know we're trying to get to zero emissions in our facilities. So for us, that means mostly transition of our energy source to renewable energy. It means a transition on refrigerants that is also significant, and a transition on transportation. Those are the main drivers. So let me just take refrigerants as an example. We've got to convert our fleet of HVAC equipment across all our stores from existing models to future low global warming potential models. It's incredibly expensive today. So, we know one scenario is policy regimes that stay the same as they are today, and it's just a net cost for us, and we know what's available technologically today, and that may be a worst case. There are alternative scenarios where you see much more aggressive policy setting at state levels in favor of zero carbon refrigeration. That would be great. We would love to see that because it creates more of a certain and level playing field and sends a market signal to providers of the equipment for innovation. And so we can make assumptions then about what happens to the cost profile of that equipment across our fleet. So that's just one example. And every decision we face, every aspect of our business, we're trying to do the best we can with the information out there to model it. Something that's nearly impossible for us to assess is Scope 3 emissions getting to net zero by 2050. What's the cost of that to Walmart? Who knows? Is that saying the entire universe has to transition? How much does that cost? And we're only now seeing people try to come up with examples that McKinsey, for example, my alma mater, full disclosure, but they're about to release quite an in-depth scenario modeling report that they've done that says, well, what's the cost to the entire economy across the different sectors we've been mentioning, the energy sector, agriculture, and so on, to transition from where we need to be to get to net zero. They've used data, a commonly accepted scenario for what that would mean. But boy, it is tough. And they're the first to admit, complex dynamic system, this is one path there. Who knows? There are many, many alternatives.
That's super, super interesting. And I'll have to find that McKinsey study. That sounds like great reading. Michelle, Lisa, what about from your point of views, just on data? I don't know if either of you want to jump in. Both of you, or I think Lisa mentioned, and Michelle, you kind of alluded to the question of ESG and how that plays in kind of capital markets. And there have been questions about the ability of kind of ESG raters to agree on who is kind of good and bad in lots of different aspects. And so I wondered if you had a sense of whether kind of the state of ESG ratings and ESG kind of data has kind of improved much over the past few years, or whether there are still big gaps. I don't know if either of you want to jump in.
Sure. Those are two separate things, ESG ratings and climate change data. So if you take ESG ratings, they are continually evolving and they are improving. But the fact is that there is no set path or no set way to evaluate this. So if you take bond ratings, credit ratings, for example, there's over a 99% correlation with the top two providers. With ESG ratings, there's less than a 50% correlation with the top two providers and only a 35% correlation if you throw in the top three. They're looking at different things and measuring it differently. We think of them as one source of information. They're a starting point. They're definitely not an ending point. Some of the common issues with ESG ratings are, one, they try and cram together E, S, and G into a single rating. So you can have a company that is wonderful on governance, has great social characteristics and credentials, horrible on E, and it gets a good rating. Or another issue, backward looking. They tend to average 5 years of historical data. And a company can change a lot in 5 years. And just like in financial analysis, we should take a forward-looking perspective. Improvement matters. We don't look at last year's EPS and say, I need to invest in this company because it had great earnings last year. You want to understand how that's going to evolve. And lastly, they're very focused on disclosure and web scraping. Does the company have a policy? Tick. Versus what you should be measuring, which is a company's strategy and actions.
Everything Michelle said, I agree with, and that's been our experience. And it'll be interesting to see what the SEC and other regulatory bodies come out with in terms of asking for standardized disclosures with respect to climate. I think that's a start. And, over time, I hope that regime will develop so that, Michelle, decision makers like you can actually get the data you need to compare companies apples to apples. The way we've tried to handle that is by disclosing ourselves as much as we can around emissions and our strategies. And to your point, what are we doing forward looking to not only decarbonize, but manage the various physical and transition risks and actually enhance our own disclosures in that regard? One of the other challenges that we see with ESG ratings indices, in addition to the ones you mentioned, because there's a lack of uniform disclosure from companies with actual comparable data, there is a tendency to over-rotate toward web scraping, social sentiment, and so on, which is easily manipulated by a whole host of actors for their own aims. So rep risk, or, looking out at how many articles got written by one company versus another, and so on. And as a large company, we really suffer from that. And you can see that in climate, right? We believe that our actions result in forward-looking strategies are distinctive, but you'd never know it from the scores in aggregate from leading ESG providers.
Yeah. I was going to say, if you take that to climate analysis, so there's a lot of providers out there that are doing climate change scenario analysis. And a couple of years ago, we kind of kicked the tires on the methodologies of about 14 different providers, and we enlisted the Columbia scientists to help us out with this. And a key learning has that this is really, really nascent. It's very much in its adolescent phase. There's no great solution out there. First of all, the underlying data is not complete. A lot, but not all companies report scope 1 and scope 2. Virtually no one reports scope 3. We'll get there eventually, but the quality of the underlying data set is not robust, and it's not particularly comparable. Different providers assess different risks. Some only do physical, some only do transition, some take into account both. And a lot miss the opportunity side of it. So for instance, a lithium miner might have high physical and high transition risks. On the other hand, there's a lot of opportunities from growth, because lithium-ion batteries are what is in electric vehicles and increasingly grid-level storage. And understanding the scenarios is really, really important. What is going into developing that? You can't just take a number and include it. You need to really, really understand what's going on. So we looked at portfolios and issuers across these different providers, and at a portfolio level and at company level, you got very, very different results. Let me give you a couple of different instances. For instance, one case, a copper miner was deemed low risk using one provider because the Toronto headquarters was being used. However, that miner has no mines in Canada. They're in Africa and coastal Latin America at high risk for impact on electricity supply due to water drought and sea level rise. Another one, two similar manufacturers. One reports scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. The other one didn't. Even though their underlying businesses are very similar, one provider was only picking up part of the data, and therefore they had very different profiles. So you really need to invest a lot of time in the interpretation and ensure, at least as an asset manager, that the analysts who are looking at their portfolio holdings and issuers are aware of the biases, flaws in the data they're seeking, and actually engage with the companies and understand it, as opposed to just taking that number is the one true picture of what climate change risk looks like.
That's really interesting. Really telling examples. Lisa, sorry, I was going to say, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. Thanks very much, guys. So I would agree with everything Kathleen and Michelle have said. There are definitely a wide range of reporting practices, certainly in relation to climate risk exposure and ESG. I just wanted to add that trend is changing. We are seeing a greater focus on disclosure and some better alignment around standards. Now, standards, are still very high level. There are big gaps in the standards that have been tabled so far. We're looking closely at SASB standards. There's lots of different frameworks that are emerging from Canadian securities regulators. Obviously, the IFRS group now is working on developing some better standards as well. So I think we're on a path. Those standards will help. But the data set is going to be problematic for quite some time to come. And, as we're looking at disclosures to help inform our assessment of our aggregate view of climate risk, we've also got to correlate that with financial performance, as Michelle has highlighted, and then credit performance as well. And so all of that is going to take time. The data the underpinning data sets are going to be ugly for a while. The modelers are not excited about this at all. And as that's from a bottom-up perspective, similar to Kathleen's comments, many organizations, including ourselves, are looking at top-down analysis, looking first at physical risk scenarios, but then we're looking at translating those scenarios into a range of economic assumptions. And as we work along that, as we proceed along that work, we have to look at what are the different policy alternatives that can be affected over time and in the near term. So all of that is very complex. None of the existing modeling tools or modeling capabilities we have in our organizations has worked through that type of analysis before. And Michelle commented earlier about some really strong partnerships with universities. We're doing the same thing. We're looking at some different regional analysis that's done that's being pulled together by universities in Western Canada to help us translate global scenarios into more regional impacts. Obviously, we've got to keep an eye on what's happening globally, but we've also got to understand how physical risks are going to impact performance in the near term. So we're doing that, but the modeling is going to be imprecise. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be wrong for a long time. And we need to layer in qualitative assessment as well. And so we are working qualitative scenarios on an ongoing basis. This is a space, that's very dynamic and is changing quickly in many aspects. So we are partnering with some different firms as well to help us think about qualitative analysis on an industry basis so that we can be a little bit more dynamic in our business practices as we're working that very long journey to evolve modeling capabilities and data sets.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you, Lisa. So it looks like we've got about 10 minutes left on the clock. So I was going to ask the panelists whether they had questions for any of the other panelists that they would like to ask. If not, I have a long list of questions I can continue to interrogate you with. But it may be more useful and insightful for our viewers that you ask each other questions. So does anyone have questions they'd like to pose to the other panelists?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question of you, Michelle. Something that I commented on earlier is, the perspective of changing risk appetite for capital providers. I know, organizations such as ours and financial services firms are looking not only at how do we manage climate risk, but how do we support a responsible transition, right? Because we all want to manage against material unintended consequences of accelerating activity in support of mitigating climate risk. So I wonder if you have a view of how investment firms are looking at changes in risk appetite as we, work through this transition. Is there a lot of balance that's finding its way into the mindset of capital providers, or are folks very hyper focused on how do we get to that net zero goal?
That's a really great question. I think we have seen an evolution. If you even go back 10 years, a lot of responsible investing or ESG investing was very values based, and it was really, I don't like this, I have widespread exclusions. I think we have really evolved from that mentality, which is a good thing, because there are multiple ways to approach this problem, and we do need to think about it differently, more deeply, and allocate capital in multiple ways. So I think what we're seeing now is people approaching it really in 4 distinct ways. One, which is becoming increasingly table stakes, is ESG integration. So let's evaluate the risks, evaluate the returns, incorporate that into our analysis, and make a decision that is now more fully informed, taking into account ESG and climate risks than we used to. That is becoming, basically everyone does that now, to varying degrees, and they're at different places along their journey. But we're asking the questions. Doesn't mean it's a no-go. It means we want to understand and quantify the risk. Then when you're looking at the capital allocation or investment side, I really think there are 3 kinds of things. One is more the best-in-class players, and that's a little bit more of a historical view. I don't want to own bad companies or companies that have high risk. Where we are seeing much more attention today on the risk side is in improvers. So being a part of that transition, supporting companies who are committed, supporting companies who are improving, actively engaging with them through your stewardship, through the company meetings, through the proxy voting, trying to get to those companies that have great strategies. Because what we want to see is that changing world. And I'd say the last is more and more money is being allocated to what I would call solutions or enablers. Companies that are producing products and services that are going to help others decarbonize. So yeah, I do think there is a shifting mentality here. It is including climate change and ESG and the risks, but there is a wider recognition that it's not just, I can only invest in best in class. I want to support that change, that drive forward too, which means a much wider range of companies are available for capital. And Kathleen, I actually had a question for you. You know, you've spoken about a lot of the initiatives underway at Walmart, and there's a lot, and it's pretty broad and comprehensive. How do you get this done? You know, how do you pivot or turn such a large organization to address some of these things, which, as you said, some of them may be perceived as, oh, this is just an incremental cost. How do you actually move from A to B and ensure that everyone in your organization, you know, is aligned on that?
Yeah. Well, the first point is about leadership and cultural integration. So we've got a commitment throughout the company, just if I take climate, for example, to get to zero emissions by 2040 in our own operations, and through our Scope 3 initiatives, you know, be part of the net zero transition by 2050. So that's deeply felt and deeply held at a cultural level from the leadership on down. And that's actually really important. So then the second is integration into our strategic planning, risk management practices, and operational planning. So you take that zero emissions target, for example, and cascade it down to each function. What does it mean for our store operations and our real estate choices? What does it mean for transportation innovation, of our fleet, our medium and heavy duty tractors? What does it mean then even for the merchants in terms of engaging suppliers and decarbonizing production of the products we sell? So practically speaking, I have a team that then works with all of those teams to integrate the choices and decisions into CapEx, into OpEx decisions, into the quarterly action plans and the KPIs and the reporting. It's quite integrated at that level. And holistically, something like refrigeration is a net cost, but then where is an offset to that in our energy efficiency initiatives or renewable energy shifts that actually create positive value or accretive to earnings, so that net we can make it work within the context of our broader economic goals. So that's how we do it. It's I think you said it first. Your first trend you're seeing is integration. I agree with you. That is that's how we're going to get it done, and that's very much how we approach it.
Kathleen, can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that, which is basically about kind of Scope 3 emissions, and it's something I've been wondering about, but I've never really kind of thought about or managed to get a good answer on. But so essentially, over the last few years with the pandemic, you've seen, and this is happening to a kind of greater or lesser extent in different places, but you've seen a change in conversations about supply chains and how companies should be managing them, and there seems to be a kind of now greater emphasis on more kind of security versus efficiency. So less kind of just in time and bigger inventories and things like that. Now, that seems to at least be the conversation. I don't know whether the data plays that out. But what I was wondering was, if that shift does happen and we move away from a kind of very fast, efficient supply chain model to one where there's kind of more security built into supply chains, where there's more where kind of risks are managed in a more risk-averse way, I guess. Does that have an effect on the kind of carbon emissions of a given supply chain or its environmental impact?
Yes, quite possibly. And, I think what you're going to see is less of a shift from efficiency toward, more days supply on hand and that sort of thing, and more optimizing the supply chain to get efficiency and resilience, a surety of supply. And that may or may not mean more inventory. There are other ways to solve for that. Mm-hmm. And so it's a much more sophisticated sourcing strategy that's optimizing across multiple variables. And so, in terms of emissions, There are much bigger factors that are driving the emissions footprint of a category like beef or row crops. For example, palm oil, some of the heavier emitting categories. And I think the real impact on decarbonizing those supply chains comes more way upstream in decarbonizing the methods of production. And then in some other categories like laundry detergent, the heavy load on emissions is the way that customers use those products. So are they washing their underwear in cold water or hot water, for example? That's part of scope 3. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that we are, again, trying to translate the big goal of let's get to net zero into what are the practical choices we can bake into operational decisions with suppliers. That's really what our Project Gigaton is about. And, what we've done is work with the scientists to translate the choices around methods of production on the farm or the factory for energy, for agriculture, for packaging, for product design, and so on, into choices that translate to an emissions impact and get people focused on the biggest opportunities in terms of an emissions ROI. That's where you're going to see the real innovation around decarbonization. And I think this other challenge we have as a global society of managing efficient supply chains plus resilience or surety, that's less of a factor when it comes to the emissions.
Okay, cool. That's really interesting. That's good. That's good to know. Wonderful. Well, I think that's us for time. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much to all our panelists. This has been a really fantastic conversation, really interesting to me with lots of kind of detailed insights. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And thank you to our audience for staying with us. And please stay with us for a bit longer yet and join us for our next session, which will be starting shortly. Thank you all and goodbye.